Today's video is another compilation of some of the worst mountaineering tragedies we have covered on this channel, from historic climbs on K2, inexperienced climbers on Everest, or even skiing down an 8,000 meter peak. We cover it all. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, as it truly does help out the channel, and as always, viewer discretion is advised.
वेलकम बैक। आपको बताएं, कातिल मौसम में K2 सर करने का मिशन। पाकिस्तानी कोहपेमा मोहम्मद अली सदपारा और गैर मुल्की कोहपेमाओं की तलाश।
पाकिस्तानी मुहिम जो मोहम्मद अली सदपारा और दो गैर
Missing climbers Mohammad Ali Sadpara of Pakistan, Iceland's John Snorri and Chile's Juan Pablo Moore.
My friends now often ask me, Ali, when are you going to die? By 2019, Muhammad Ali Sadpara had lost 12 of his 14 colleagues in the mountaineering business, but this would certainly not stop him from going on to conquer multiple 8,000er peaks. Originally from Pakistan, Ali Sadpara was quite literally born into a mountaineering family. The art would be passed down from generation to generation, and in 2021, Ali, along with his own son, Sajid Ali Sadpara, would be attempting to achieve a winter summit of K2. This is their story. Muhammad Ali Sadpara was born on February 2nd, 1976, and is the son of famous Pakistani mountaineer Hassan Sadpara. Ali's father Hassan would become the first Pakistani to have climbed 6 8,000ers, including Everest and K2. 5 of those peaks would be without supplemental oxygen, with Everest being the only 8,000er where oxygen was used. Hassan would go on to have 11 children, but only 4 would survive, with the youngest being Ali. Even though Hassan was a famous mountaineer, their family was poor. Ali would grow up in a village in one of the river valleys of the Himalayan Baltistan region in Pakistan's extreme north. They would mainly live off the land by raising livestock and farming, with some income coming in from a low-level government employee job their father had. It was not the lavish lifestyle you see on television, but for them, it was enough. From an early age, it was evident that Ali took after his father and was an athlete. His body composition matched most mountaineers, and this would be further proven when Ali, as a boy, spent many days climbing up and down rocks around his village. He would gain notoriety in his small community, with many claiming that he moved faster than the goats. Ali's father, Hassan, never had the luxury of an education, so it was important to Ali that he took his studies seriously. Although this couldn't be said about one of Ali's older brothers, who struggled with his academics early on. This would lead Hassan to pack up his family and move to Skardu, where the children could receive a better education. Ali would go on to finish his studies, and at the age of 19, he felt ready to marry. Due to their culture and customs, he was not allowed to approach his soon-to-be wife, Fatima, so his uncle would ask on his behalf. It took some convincing, but Fatima's parents would accept. Marriage brought Ali happiness, but it also brought newly found pressure. His wife would soon be pregnant with their son, Sajid, so it fell on Ali to provide for his family quickly. Using his skill set, he would turn to the mountains as a source of income. Being only a teenager, he would begin serving as a porter for foreign mountaineering expeditions, where if he was lucky, could earn up to $3 a day. It was hard and grueling work. The porters would be asked to carry a minimum of 25 kilos to various camps like K2 and Broad Peak. Since Ali did not have much wealth, he was unable to afford luxuries like climbing boots. Instead, he would cross the rugged Baltoro Glacier in flip-flops and cast-off gear. On just Ali's second day of being a porter, he dropped his sunglasses during his route. Luckily, his father was following behind him, noticed, and picked them up off the ground. Later in the day, when Ali came upon a blazing expanse of snow, he would look for his sunglasses in a panic. Hassan watched his son struggle for a few minutes before pulling out the glasses from his pocket and handing them over, but not before telling Ali, "Small mistakes become big in the mountains. This one might have cost you your sight." As time went on, Ali's skills only grew. He developed into a very strong technical climber and desired more for himself and his family. That time would come when a Pakistani army truck pulled into the town of Satpara in hopes of recruiting climbers to ferry supplies to soldiers in remote mountain passes. During the 1980s, Pakistan was in conflict with India over the Siachen Glacier, and this would play a pivotal role in Ali's life. There was not much to be said about Ali's time with the army. He would spend most of the time scaling snow and ice, but there was one day that he would never forget. As he and a fellow Pakistani climber settled into their camp for the night, Ali remembers a soldier next to him smoking a cigarette. Within minutes, their location was receiving heavy mortar fire, completely flattening a tent with 2 men inside. Ali recalls the sound of their bodies thrashing as they took their last breath. After this experience, Ali moved on from his time with the army, and this would lead him to commercial mountaineering. Between the years 2006 to 2018, Ali would go on to become one of, if not the best Pakistani mountaineer in history. His first 8,000er summit would be Gasher Brum 2, which was done in second-hand climbing gear, I might add, followed by the Killer Mountain, or better known as Nanga Parbat, and many more. For some reason, Ali would fall in love with specifically Nanga Parbat and achieve some of his most impressive accomplishments on that peak. In 2016, he would be part of a team that achieved the first ever winter summit under temperatures of negative 47 degrees Celsius, and in 2017, he would achieve the first ever autumn summit. The mountain became such an integral part of his life that many attribute the peak's advancement in mountaineering directly to his efforts. Overall, Ali would summit all of the 8,000er peaks in Pakistan and 3 more outside of the country, bringing his total to 8. Despite his success, Ali really struggled to find a consistent sponsor for his climbs, so when Icelandic high-altitude mountaineer John Snorri approached him in wanting to attempt a winter summit on K2, it was easy to say yes. By this time, Ali was approaching 45, and his son, Sajid, was a young adult that had begun developing his own mountaineering skills, already having some experience on K2. The father-son duo would team up and join John on their expedition to the Savage Mountain. They did not have very much time to prepare, as the winter months were already upon them, but by November of 2020, they were organized and ready for their journey. At that time, a winter summit on K2 was one of the last great challenges in the mountaineering community, although the challenge does not actually begin on the mountain, but rather trying to get to base camp. The location of the peak is in an isolated region that straddles the border of Pakistan and China. For Ali, Sajid, and John, this would mean their 2-week hike would be over 60 miles, traversing rugged roads and snow-covered valleys. By December of 2020, there were multiple expeditions already setting up lines and supplies on K2 in preparation for a summit push, but the weather made it hard to keep campsites stable, especially the higher up you go. The Savage Mountain is notorious for being an extremely difficult climb, and although the mountain is often compared to Everest, a climber actually has a further distance to travel on K2. This is because the base camp of Everest rests at a higher altitude than K2's. By January of 2021, the average temperature on the mountain was about negative 51 degrees Celsius, with wind strengths up to 120 kilometers per hour. On some days, the higher altitude camps would either be completely wiped off the mountain or deeply buried in snow, causing the expeditions to re-establish camps 2 and 3 every so often. For the most part, the weather in January was miserable, but there would be one team that saw an opportunity and took it. On January 16th, a team of 10 Nepali climbers, most notably Netflix's 14 Peaks climber Nims Persia, would achieve a winter summit of K2. Under normal circumstances, most would stop right there, since the goal of being the first is no longer possible. But this actually fueled Ali even more to reach the peak. Furthermore, the Nepali team would end up using supplemental oxygen on their summit bid, so in order to have his own record, Ali would now make the attempt without the help of O2 cylinders. When asked why he cared so much, Ali would state, "The Nepalese had done it weeks earlier, and I wanted to do it too, because K2 is our mountain." And that chance would certainly come. Towards the end of January and early February, there was a small window of good weather, and most expeditions would begin their summit push at this time. Over the next few days, more than 30 climbers would work their way up the mountain. Most would turn back before hitting the death zone, or 8,000 meters, except for Ali, Sajid, John, and a Chilean mountaineer, Juan Pablo Moore, who had joined the three before their ascent. The group started their summit bid in the early hours of February 4th, right around 7,400 meters. They were about 14 hours from the top, and were expecting to make their final push the next morning. Their progress was steady, and the climb went as expected. The weather was not great, but it was good enough to climb. Night turned to day, and on February 5th at 10 a.m., all four climbers were right under the bottleneck, only 400 meters below the summit. The men had been in the death zone for multiple hours, and this was certainly starting to take its toll on Sajid, as he was not feeling well. He would communicate his condition to his father, who would tell his son to use their emergency oxygen cylinder they had brought along. As Sajid began rummaging in his gear looking for the proper equipment, Ali, John, and Moore started to scale the bottleneck, and pretty soon they were gaining distance on Sajid, who after a minute or two finally got his mask regulator and oxygen connected. But once the connection was made, the mask regulator sprung a leak. Ali would hear of this and shout down to his son, "Don't worry, keep climbing, you'll feel better." But Sajid just did not have the strength to continue, and so he decided to turn back. He remembered seeing his father and the two other climbers around noon, confirming they had made it past the bottleneck, leaving them with no major obstacles from the summit. The three men had a GPS beacon with them, but this would freeze and inevitably stop working. Sajid would end up making it back safely to Camp 4, but sadly, his father would never be heard from again. The very next day, February 6th, a search party would quickly be organized and backed by the Pakistani government as two helicopters flew up to 7,000 meters looking for any sign. Unfortunately, as the hours ticked by, the weather began to deteriorate, which prevented them from searching longer into the evening. On February 18th, 13 days after the summit push, all three climbers were officially declared dead. This announcement was delayed as they were holding out hope, but given the hostile environment of negative 80 degrees Celsius, it is unreasonable to expect anyone to survive under those conditions. There is strong reason to believe that the three climbers, Ali, John, and Moore, did in fact reach the summit. Most deaths on K2 actually happened during the descent of the climb. It would not be until 5 months later, on July 26th, that all three men's bodies were found. A team of Sherpas scaling the mountain had spotted Moore first near Camp 4. As they climbed, they found Ali near the bottleneck and John 100 meters above him. It appeared as though they were working their way down, further indicating that they did in fact reach the summit, but honestly, nobody will ever know for certain. Sajid would help with the recovery of his father and has gone on to develop a strong mountaineering career himself. In 2023 alone, he has conquered Annapurna, Everest, and Nanga Parbat, all without supplemental oxygen. But what I think is most impressive is that in July of 2021, the same month he would assist with his father's recovery, Sajid would go on to summit K2 and finish what he started. It is no secret that this year on Everest will go down as one of the deadliest in our history. By July 2022, 310 mountaineers have already lost their lives on the tallest peak in the world, and with 17 dead climbers in 2023 alone, the numbers have significantly increased. Some blame the dangers on global warming, while others seem to attribute the chaos on Everest being directly related to the increase of foot traffic. While this peak is a dream for many mountaineers, it is not without significant risks and challenges. Today we discuss a Hungarian climber, Szilárd Suhasda, that would take the ultimate challenge of trying to conquer Everest solo, but not before coming face to face with the dangers of the tallest mountain in the world. This is his story. There have been concerns that the increased human activity at Everest Base Camp, which is located on the Khumbu Glacier, is making it unstable and unsafe. In order to cater to the demands of upwards of 400 climbers annually, about 1,500 people will come to base camp during the season, where luxury facilities can include massages and evening entertainment. According to a recent survey by The Guardian, Everest's glaciers have lost 2,000 years of ice in just the past 30 years. This has not gone unnoticed by experts or even the local community looking at the risk of keeping Everest Base Camp on the Khumbu Glacier. Just last year, there were talks of having base camp move off the thinning glacier to a safer location lower down on the mountain. Unfortunately, many Sherpas have voiced their disapproval with this change, as it would add 3 hours to the climb while also increasing the technical difficulty. This is a no-win situation, as moving the camp may delay the melting of the glacier but increase the risk every climber must take, or not moving base camp will continue to harm the mountain. Currently, the community is still theorizing ways to move base camp, but not significantly increase the risk of climbing the mountain. A record-breaking 479 permits were granted, with reports of lines on Everest being up to 12 hours long in some cases. And it's easy to see why the government in Nepal is doing this, despite the risk and public backlash. The minimum payment for a permit is around $15,000 US, but in recent years Everest has become more of a tourist destination, with some thrill-seeking individuals willing to pay upwards of $60,000 US just to be guided to the summit. However, I believe the fault falls in multiple areas, with one of them being the companies willing to accept payment from inexperienced climbers. These companies require no climbing experience, saying they will teach you everything needed, but the realistic fact is that if a client gets in trouble in high altitude, they can and will be abandoned to save the lives of others, as once you cross into the death zone, there is typically no way to help a struggling climber, even if a guide wanted to. Szilárd Suhajda is not exactly what you would call a beginner climber. Originally from Békéscsaba, Hungary, he would start his climbing journey as a backpacker who just enjoyed long hikes. His passion would eventually lead him to hike along the Carpathians, Transylvania, and the Alps. From there, Suhajda would develop an interest in the alpine style of climbing, which is considered the most basic but pure form of mountaineering. An alpine climber does not use supplemental oxygen, nor do they carry large amounts of supplies on the peak. Typically, you will see them climb alone or in a pair, because the goal is to move as fast as possible. The increase in risk is obvious, and because of this, alpine-style climbers are made up of some of the most technically skilled and mentally tough individuals the sport has ever seen. Suhajda would end up summiting Mont Blanc, and this is where his love for mountaineering really grew to an obsession. In 2014, at the age of 31, he and a fellow Hungarian climber would summit Broad Peak, his first 8,000er. In 2019, 5 years later, Suhajda would undertake his most difficult challenge to that point in his life and summit the Savage Mountain, K2, becoming the first Hungarian to reach the peak. Suhajda would announce in early 2022 that he would focus his efforts on the top 5 tallest mountains in the world, and he would not wait long before conquering Lhotse in May of 2022, completely solo. Coming into 2023, he would be turning 40, and it was well known by family members that Suhajda's next mountain would be Everest. It can take years of planning to gather all the required documents and procedures, but Suhajda was finally ready. He had his permit and would be attempting the peak on his own terms, once again solo. The summer months were fast approaching as all the Sherpas and porters began preparing Everest Base Camp for the climbing season, and many would notice that he was not a man of many words, but instead, as someone that was determined and focused on completing the task at hand. One thing was clear, he meant business. The climbing season on Everest started early this year, but the best time window to reach the summit was May 15th through May 26th. Suhajda knew this and would prepare accordingly. Leading up to the middle of May, he would make acclimatization trips on the mountain to get his body used to the high altitude conditions, and to also set up camps for later use on his summit push. Acclimation climbs are essentially when an individual will climb to a desired point on a high altitude peak, rest, and return back to base camp. This process is repeated many times and allows the climber's body to become more accustomed to the lack of oxygen the higher up they go. Above 8,000 meters or 26,000 feet, we start entering the atmosphere that contains little to no oxygen. Scientists have nicknamed this area the death zone due to the inability to sustain long-term life. Extended exposure in these areas, especially for a climber not using supplemental oxygen, is deadly. After many weeks of preparation, the Hungarian climber would set off from base camp on May 21st at 5,500 meters, alone, with only the gear on his back and a radio that had a GPS beacon. The weather was perfect, there were no clouds in sight, the sun was bright, the blue sky towered over him, and the temperatures were on the warmer side. Well, for Everest anyways. All good indications for a mountaineer. Suhajda would be loosely following the popular South Col route from Nepal, and there were many expeditions following the same path up the mountain. Experiencing delays in certain bottleneck areas could not be avoided, but being a solo climber definitely has its advantages when trying to move around larger crowds. With more people on the mountain, there would inevitably be more trash as well, and Suhajda definitely noticed this. Everest used to be an untouched part of nature that was mystical and challenging, but today there are areas covered in debris left behind, further representing just how much expeditions on this mountain have changed. Suhajda would climb like this for 3 days. He was careful, not wanting to make simple mistakes. The climb was mentally and physically taxing, almost more than what was originally expected. Every night, he would find the small ledge where he had previously set up his makeshift campsites and pitch his tent, slowly making progress up the mountain until on May 24th, he was ready for a summit push. That morning, Suhajda would rise early from his tent, well before the sun had risen. As predicted by the weather experts below, today truly seemed to be a perfect day to reach the summit of Everest. Although still dark, the sky was clear of any clouds, there was no wind, and the temperature was relatively warm. After getting a bite to eat, he started his journey upwards. By 7:30 a.m., Suhajda had climbed up to the balcony on Everest, but his body was deteriorating quickly in the death zone. Suhajda's energy levels were just not what he was used to, and it was increasingly difficult to keep his mind clear as the lack of oxygen began playing tricks. Ben Ferrer, a member of the Seven Summits climb team, was returning from the summit when he came across Suhajda sitting alone on the balcony. They would exchange greetings, and Suhajda would ask Ben for the altitude. Ben replied 8,400 meters and would notice how tired he sounded. Ben thought Suhajda was asking for the altitude to inform his team of his turning around point, but this was the wrong assumption. Before Ben left, he would take a picture of Suhajda, never imagining this would be the last visual record of the man. It was not until 6 hours later until we hear about Suhajda again. This time, another mountaineer, Canadian Elias Sakali, would pass by Suhajda much later in the day near 4 p.m. He had made some progress since he was last spotted by Ben, climbing about 300 meters. Elia would attempt to talk to Suhajda, but for the most part was ignored. This was concerning, as the sun was beginning to set and the wind had picked up. It was too late in the day to reasonably continue for the summit. Suhajda did not say a word as he passed Elia. He just kept walking. There really was nothing that could be done. Elia would continue his descent, but as he climbed, he thought back on the situation and realized that Suhajda did not have a backpack with him. This meant that he would have no supplies if stuck on the mountain, which only solidified Elia's thought that Suhajda would not be returning. However, right before Elia lost vision of the summit, he looked up and saw Suhajda only a few meters below the peak. Overnight contact with Suhajda was lost, besides a random GPS ping right under the Hillary Step at 8,790 meters. A Chinese climber and his Sherpa would reach the summit of Everest the next morning and notice Suhajda laying down off the well-beaten route. He was not tied to any fixed line. In order to reach his location, the Sherpa would need to traverse a dangerous section. It was reported that Suhajda was in fact alive at this time, but suffering from frostbite and high-altitude sickness. Unfortunately, the Sherpa was unable to assist, as his own Chinese client was heavily struggling himself, and thus Suhajda was left on the mountain. After hearing the news back at base camp that Suhajda was still alive, a team of 3 Sherpas were quickly put together. The team would be taken by helicopter to Camp 2, and from there would work their way up to Suhajda's last known location. It would take about 6 hours to reach their destination, and under normal circumstances, this journey would take about 18 hours to traverse. The Sherpas set out on May 26 from Camp 2, 2 days after Suhajda's summit push, and 1 day since he was last seen alive. When the team of Sherpas arrived at his last known location, he was nowhere to be found. They would search all day, even looking at the summit, but ultimately the search would be called off, and Suhajda was pronounced dead, although they would never find his body. What is interesting about this story is that it turns out that Suhajda never left with his gear on May 24th. His clothing and tent were found by a Sherpa back near Camp 2, indicating he was pushing for the summit quite literally with only the clothes on his back. From record-breaking permits to global warming, and even the amount of trash being left behind, it is clear that in recent times, Everest has changed. Well, maybe not Everest, but those willing to try and conquer it. Hungarian climbers Zalard Suhajda's story only brings more light to these troubling issues, but also once again shows the dangers of a mountain like Everest. Skiing down an 8,000-meter mountain is ridiculous. I think many of us can agree on that statement, but in 2018, Hillary Nelson and Jim Morrison would complete the first ski descent of Lhotse, the fourth tallest peak in the world, making history and forever changing the extreme sport. In 2022, the pair would decide to take on Manaslu, but the climbing season that would follow was dominated by heavy snowfall and avalanches, making it one of the most difficult years in the mountain's history. This is their story. Manaslu is actually considered to be one of the easiest 8,000ers, with many climbers using the mountain as preparation for its neighbor Everest. The mountain's long ridges and valley glaciers offer feasible approaches from all directions, and culminate in a peak that towers steeply above its surrounding landscape. But this is still an 8,000-meter mountain. After all, there are only 14 in the world, and they all come with their own unique challenges. 2022 was a historic year for Manaslu. Early in the year, the Himalayan database, who many look to for a reliable tracking source for reportable mountain summits, would make a public statement that from now on, it will only credit the summit of Manaslu to those who reach the highest point shown in a drone picture. This change in summit accreditation is recommended and supported by foreign and Nepali operators who we have consulted in Kathmandu. The statement came after numerous summit claims on the mountain had become controversial, as photographic evidence indicated that the majority of climbers in recent years claiming summits of the mountain had in fact stopped 20 to 25 feet short of the true summit. The results of this change are evident, as many climbers revisited the peak in 2022, with permits soaring to more than 400, more than twice the amount in 2021, and the most in the mountain's history. The mountain's most intimidating feature is the true summit, as the false summit is separated from the top by a long and dangerously sharp, concise ridge. This area is known for soft snow, bad weather, and avalanches. This would come to define the 2022 season. Hillary Nelson was a 49-year-old American from Seattle, where she grew up skiing and climbing mountains starting at the age of 3. Her mountaineering career would span over 2 decades, and she would become one of the most decorated climbers the world has ever seen. But what made her special was she combined the two sports she loved, climbing and skiing. In 1996, she would become the European Women's Extreme Skiing Champion. In 2005, she would ski down from the summit of Cho Oyu, her first 8,000er. In 2011, it would be Denali, America's tallest peak. In 2012, she would become the first female climber ever to summit Everest and Lhotse in 24 hours. But in 2018, she would complete one of her most impressive and difficult challenges. After reaching the summit of Lhotse, the fourth tallest mountain of the world, Hillary and her partner Jim would attempt to ski down from the top through the Lhotse Couloir. The challenge is obvious. Climbing mountains, especially those over 8,000 meters, was one of the most physically and mentally draining things a human can do. But deciding to carry your skis to the top of a mountain, where the oxygen is already thin, slowly deteriorating your body and mind, then making the conscious decision to strap them on and ski your way down the peak. It's madness. It is hard for me to express the difficulty of having the energy to ski or make jump turns above 8,000 meters. Many famous mountaineers have called Hillary and her partner Jim Morrison's tenacity in the death zone as incredible. On September 30th, 2018, the couple would complete the first ski descent of Lhotse and culminate into one of her most famous films, instantly shooting her into legendary status. Later, reflecting on the accomplishment, Hillary would state, "I've been on many expeditions, but only a surprisingly few have been objectives that kept me awake at night, that I would spend hours navigating Google Maps trying to gain some special insight. It's these select destinations, individual mountains, that I feel compelled to climb, to ski, to touch, to engage with both physically and mentally." Because of this accomplishment, Hillary would be named as one of National Geographic's 2018 Adventurers of the Year, along with the 25 most adventurous women of the past 25 years by Men's Journal. But one of the things I find most fascinating about Hillary's story is her ability to be a mother of 2 young boys, yet still maintain a mountaineering career. It is extremely difficult to reason putting yourself in dangerous conditions while having 2 young children. I always find that it's really hard for me to leave home and switch that identity, go from mom, family, busy to climber. I'm also happy and living intensely in these moments, and I have explained that to my kids, and we talk about all this stuff, and it means that much to me that it's worth it. Jim and Hillary plan on climbing Manaslu in September of 2022, as the fall is the safest time period on the mountain. This is typically when the weather is the most reasonable, not the brutal cold of the winter or the unstable monsoons in the summer. Similar to all other expeditions, after Jim and Hillary arrived at base camp, they would begin acclimating to the mountain through acclimatization trips, but the weather was the opposite of what they expected. There was almost a constant snowfall, making it difficult to climb the peak, causing many expeditions to abandon their attempts before starting. But this would not stop everyone. By late September, it had snowed for 15 days straight, and the snowfall was described as so intense that it was 4 to 5 feet deep near the death zone. Although the conditions were rough, the summit window was predicted to be only a few days this season, so Jim and Hillary, along with many other teams, began making their final preparations for a summit push in late September. The first summits would come the final week of the month, with climber Kristen Harla describing the conditions. Manaslu was probably the hardest summit push I ever had. We had started out from base camp on Monday, and Tuesday we had a short climb to Camp 2. Heavy snowfall and the weather forecast looked like more snow that night. We talked about climbing down, as most others did, but luckily we decided to climb up to Camp 3 to see if the weather forecast was wrong. We knew it would be a long summit push from Camp 3, so we started out at 8:30 p.m. We had incredibly beautiful weather. Trails halfway up to Camp 4, but the last half we had to break trail and pull up the rope. We heard some avalanches when we climbed. Deep, heavy snow and no trails made it very challenging. Finally, we made it to the summit ridge. Many small avalanches when we stepped on the ridge, and I have to say, just getting to the 4 summit is not easy in this condition. We rappelled down, did the traverse, and climbed up to the middle top. When I climbed up there, heavy snow came down on me, and the last part to the real summit was not easy either. After 19 hours, we finally reached the summit. On September 26, just days after the first summit, Jim and Hillary would eclipse the final ridge at 10:42 a.m., reaching the true summit of Manaslu in what was described as tough conditions. They quickly transitioned from climbing to skiing, wasting no time in the cold and wind. Their plan was to ski around the summit ridge and regroup with their Sherpa team, with Jim going first and Hillary following him. The snow was thick, but very soft. Jim made it around the corner and watched as Hillary followed him, but the powder under her skis started to collapse. Hillary had started a small avalanche. Within seconds, she was swept off her feet and carried down a narrow snow slope on the south side. The south side was the direct opposite slope they had climbed, and there was no trail, making it nearly impossible for Jim to do anything but watch in horror as Hillary tumbled off the sharp ridge and down the steep slope. The mountain has no natural breaks or safe points, meaning her body and skis were soon covered by a cloud of snow to where Jim could no longer see her, but there was no stopping her fall. Rescue efforts would begin immediately, but everything would be delayed as the same day another avalanche would take place between Camp 3 and 4 at 7,000 meters, taking the life of a Sherpa and injuring 12 other climbers. To make matters worse, the fixed lines from Camp 3 that go to the summit would be completely covered by snow, making it nearly impossible to descend the mountain until the lines were re-established. The following day, a search helicopter would spot a ski and some clothes at 1,900 meters below the summit, but because of poor weather conditions, they could not confirm if it was Hillary. Jim would be flown to the location with 2 Sherpas the following day with a sinking feeling in his stomach. There, they would find Hillary. It would take them an hour and a half to dig her out of the snow before her remains would be flown to Kathmandu. Jim would describe the events via Instagram and finish his posts with the words, "Peace be with us all. Pray for her family and community, which is broadly stretched across our planet. I'm devastated by her loss." The support for Hillary would soon follow, as it was obvious what a climber, skier, and person the entire community had lost. But the 2022 climbing season was not over. A few days later after Hillary's death on October 2nd, another avalanche would take place, originating above Camp 2, but eventually flowing down the mountain and covering base camp. The videos of the accident are truly frightening, and unfortunately another Sherpa would lose his life as he was descending from Camp 2 to Camp 1. 7 Summits would also report 2 more avalanches higher on the mountain, but thankfully, there were no injuries. This was the final day that anyone would try to climb Manaslu in 2022, as almost all expeditions that were still on the mountain decided to end their season and pack up for the winter. While we don't normally see the 8th tallest mountain in the world as a difficult peak to climb, 2022 was a representation of just how unstable even the simplest mountains can be. The season was absolutely brutal for anyone on the peak, even those that reached the summit. After a successful climb, one of the few mountaineers who did reach the top would describe the peak. Many say that Manaslu is one of the easiest 8,000 meters. Maybe, in good condition, but I think it is good to remember that the condition on the mountain have a lot to say about how easy the climb gets. K2 has a problem. 2022 was a historic year for one of the most dangerous mountains in the world, and 2023 is gearing up to be even more historic. With this year's season already in full swing, we should hopefully be seeing the news of summits taking place, and we can only pray for the safety of those on the peak. K2 has always been the world's most difficult test for the top mountaineers in the world, and has gained the nickname the Savage Mountain because of its unpredictability and technical skill needed to scale it. Australian Matthew Eakin was an impactful part of the mountaineering community, who had the knowledge and skill to take on a mountain such as K2, but what he would experience on that deadly pyramid-shaped beauty would end his life. This is his story. K2 is actually not significantly different from Everest, as each mountain is suffering the same trend the last couple of years. Record-breaking permits and climbers, along with trash and supplies being left behind. There is no better example than K2's Camp 2, which has always been notorious for being a tent graveyard. But K2 suffers these problems on a much smaller scale than the world's tallest peak. The main reasons are the base camp of the mountain is extremely difficult to reach, and is void of any human habitation. There are no luxurious tents or fancy dinners waiting for you on the Savage Mountain. You will only have access to what you can carry in, which is typically the basics for human survival. Many expert mountaineers continue to warn inexperienced climbers from trying K2. Alan Arnett, creator of one of the great mountaineering blogs, wrote, "There is chatter about how Sherpas had to support inexperienced climbers this season. They would take on and off their clients' crampons, move their Jumar across anchors, tell them when to walk and when to sleep, and more. This level of micromanagement is disturbing. Experienced climbers, especially on a mountain like K2, have this knowledge in their muscle memory." Pakistan, the mountain's home country, finally raised the cost of permits in 2022 for the first time in 20 years to help combat this issue. Well, kind of anyways. This is actually a return to 2001 prices, where permits to climb the Savage Mountain will cost $12,000 for a 7-member team. Experienced climbers can get away with paying these rates, but for those that need extensive guides and help, it can cost well over $100,000 to even attempt to climb. This is significantly more expensive than Everest because of the increased difficulty. As we continue to see more and more climbers summit Everest, it is hard to believe that K2 is not far behind, as long as inexperienced climbers are willing to fork up the money. But hopefully the dangers and difficulty of the peak will sway all those that are not fully committed. While Everest has a death rate of 1%, K2 holds a staggering 25% death rate according to NASA, meaning approximately 1 person dies on K2 for every 4 who reach the summit, compared to 1 in every 100 climbers on Everest. Matthew Eakin certainly understood the risks of the mountain. The 41-year-old Australian was a co-founder of Mountaineers Down Under, a local community of climbers that would connect over their passion and discuss equipment, routes, trips, and all great things related to mountaineering. Not much is known about Matthew's childhood. but we do know that by the time he was 41 and a tax lawyer, he had over 8 years of experience climbing high-altitude peaks in the Nepal and Karakoram regions. He had summited 2 8,000ers before 2022, Manaslu in 2017 and Broad Peak in 2019. I will note that his summit of Manaslu was not the true summit we know today, but either way, both accomplishments are impressive. Matt would say when asked about the fear of climbing an 8,000er, it was more just the sheer amount of suffering involved. It's a huge peak. There's lots of effort. The physical toll, the mental toll, and just the sheer effort of going 1 foot after the other. It's pretty amazing being 8,000 meters above everything and looking down and seeing everything below you. You feel enormously high. You're on top of the peak and you can almost see the curvature of the earth. It's pretty special. Matt would decide that his next test in 2022 would be the Savage Mountain, and he would team up with a small group using Adventure Pakistan Treks and Expedition Logistics. The entire group was made up of 6 individuals, but the primary climbers we will be covering were Matt and Canadians Richard Cartier and Justin Dubé-Fahmy. Richard, being the oldest of the group, was a 60-year-old physician from St. Jerome, Canada, who had been climbing mountains for decades and was known for his attention to safety. All 3 climbers shared similar climbing styles, so when working together, it just felt natural. They would all arrive in Pakistan in early June, which is the start of the climbing season on K2. The mountain is notorious for having dangerously unpredictable weather, and that is the main reason that practically no one tries to climb outside of June through August. Those that do are some of the most experienced climbers on our planet. There have been 8 winter expeditions. Only 1 has ever been successful. A 10-man team from Nepal made history in January of 2021, summiting the peak in the brutal conditions. But for everyone else, the summer months are the only chance to reach the top of the 2nd tallest mountain in the world. To reach the base camp of K2, it is a 7 to 8 day trek of carrying your own supplies through the Karakoram Mountains. The camp in no way can compare to Everest, as most of the supplies and tents are carried in by the teams, and they only bring what is needed for the climb, as getting supplies to the desolate mountain is a difficult process. After the 6-man team reached base camp, they would rest a few days, but almost immediately begin acclimatization trips in mid to late June. The plan was to take 50 to 60 days, with the summit window being late July at the 45-day mark, when the weather is at its most reasonable opportunity. They would be climbing the Abruzzi Spur, which is the most popular route to summit the peak, being used by 75% of all climbers. But in recent years, this has caused issues. Because of the mountain having very small summit windows, the route can be overcrowded with lines of climbers trying to reach the pinnacle. There are 3 famous landmarks on the route, 2 having more rock climbing elements in the House Chimney and Black Pyramid, and the final, infamous landmark that we have all seen pictures of, the Bottleneck, a giant serac that hangs over climbers as they make their way up through a narrow couloir, just one piece of ice falling to end it all. Another issue with a mountain like K2 is that even acclimating to the altitude is different, as simple access to climb is hard to come by. It is no secret that Sherpas take on the brunt of the work when guiding or laying the fixed ropes, but on K2, because of the unpredictability of the weather, it is not uncommon for fixed lines to be set higher up on the mountain on summit day, meaning reaching the higher camps are impossible until that point. This ultimately delays the acclimatization process, but the 6-man team would finish multiple trips, and in mid-July, bad weather would delay their efforts to make a final trip before attempting the summit. On July 21st, when the weather cleared, they planned on making the final climb up the Savage Mountain. The group would climb for 16 hours straight, from base camp to Japanese Camp 3 at 7,000 meters. Then the following day, they would push for Camp 4 at 7,600 meters. Justin would post on Facebook that the mountain was starting to get cold and the group was tired after 2 big days of climbing. The following days, the mountain presented a perfect weather opportunity to reach the summit. The 3 climbers would all split on the 22nd, with Richard starting his descent due to being exhausted, with Justin eventually following him hours later after warming up in Camp 4. Matt, feeling great, would continue pushing up the mountain. July 22nd would mark a historic day for K2. There were lines of climbers all the way from Camp 4 to the top, as a record-breaking 100 summits were recorded that day, the largest number of summits in a single day in the mountain's history. Matt would be just under the chaos, planning on reaching the top of the mountain the following day. On July 23rd, Matt would stand on the pinnacle of the Savage Mountain. A day after the tallest point was covered with mountaineers, he stood alone after one of the most difficult climbs he had ever experienced. But the descent on a mountain like K2 is notoriously more dangerous than the trip up the mountain. Matt would relay the news to base camp and to his family that he had reached the summit and was beginning his trip down the mountain. The first tragedy of July 23rd would strike lower on the mountain, as Richard, who was on his descent alone, would slip at some point below Camp 1. Unfortunately, nobody saw the accident, and the alarms were never raised until Justin reached base camp hours later and noticed Richard had never made it down the mountain. Unfortunately, Richard would never return to base camp. Further up on the mountain, Matt would make the descent through the death zone and then the bottleneck, eventually reaching Japanese Camp 3 at 7,000 meters. This is where for the final time he would reach out to base camp and let them know of his progress, but shortly after that message, Matt would tragically never be heard from again. No one knows what happened. Possibly he fell after slipping or when a rock struck him, but for days, those at base camp were left just wondering where the climber was. 2 days later, 2 men were climbing just above base camp when Matt and Richard's bodies were found, confirming that both climbers had fallen during the descent. There were no indications of trauma, as both bodies were frozen but intact. The slopes between Camp 1 and 2 were not inherently dangerous, although the house chimney lays in this area, which is more of a steep cliff than a slope. But like all 8,000ers, the elevation gain, even in less technical areas, are deceptive, and one slip can send you tumbling for hundreds of feet down the mountain. The 2 men that found Matt were unable to move his body, so instead they would take a note of his location, turn around, and make their way back to advanced base camp for assistance. But shortly after they left, the Savage Mountain reared its head one more time. An avalanche would be triggered just above the location, burying Matt. Over the following 2 days, teams attempted to dig him out of the snow and ice, but despite their very best efforts, were unsuccessful. Matt would remain buried, but his location was well known, and because of the unique situation, Matt's family would plead for a body recovery, with the sister stating, "If it's safe for members of a search team, we believe that all climbers who die in the mountains while pursuing their passion should have a chance to be found and buried to ease the grieving process for families and friends." His family stated they wanted to bury him with dignity, rather than risk the snow melt uncovering his body in the future, and I can certainly empathize with this, but only if we are not putting additional climbers at risk. A number of Matt's friends who were a part of the mountaineering community would commit to an expedition to retrieve his body in February of 2023, as his location was marked with a GPS. While they did raise over 76,000 Australian dollars for the expedition, the actual members and details have been kept private. However, we do know it was made up of 9 members. At this time, I could not find any public information on whether they were successful or not, but I know that the process could not have been easy on a mountain like K2. Both Matthew and Richard's stories simply highlight the problems that we are seeing on mountains like Everest and K2. It is simply a fact that with increasing permits, there will continue to be inexperienced climbers on both mountains. But on the Savage Mountain, I along with many others will continue to caution anyone attempting to climb K2 without the proper experience. Unfortunately, it feels like money will always speak louder. As you watch this video, there are even more climbers on the mountain trying to reach the summit, but we can only hope that everyone returns home. Mount Everest is the ultimate dream for most mountaineers. Many go through years of training and prior climbing experiences just to prepare themselves for such a peak. The reason is simple. Mount Everest is the tallest peak in the world, with an elevation of 8,849 meters above sea level. The long climb spans over multiple days, exposing you to some of the most brutal conditions possible. There is no denying that reaching the summit marks a significant achievement in many people's lives. However, climbing Mount Everest certainly has a price. In 2023, 17 climbers died on Everest, 9 of which happened in May alone. Today we will focus on 2 of these climbers, both at different stages in life, but on the mountain at the same time. This is their story. In the past, the expectation when you attempted an Everest summit was that you were a strong, self-sufficient climber with experience that could handle most situations. However, in recent years, we clearly see that in some cases, this is no longer true. Instead, third-party expedition companies can advertise their Everest trips by needing little to no experience, as they will guide you step by step to the summit, as long as they are well paid, of course. The reasons why this is dangerous are quite obvious, as more and more inexperienced climbers attempt to summit Everest. This has certainly led to controversy building up in the community, and there is no better example than 59-year-old Indian teacher Suzanne Leopoldina Jesus. With record-breaking climbing permits granted for expeditions, Suzanne, a part of the Glacier Himalayan Trek, would travel to Nepal and from there Everest Base Camp in early May. Camp would be busy, to say the least, as there were over 47 different teams, all trying to reach the top. Typically, summit bids have to be shared across multiple expeditions, as the weather will only permit a few good days at high altitudes, which understandably causes long lines to build up in various locations. The weather in May fluctuated greatly on Everest, but the conditions would slightly improve as the month went on. The temperature would hover around 27 degrees Fahrenheit or -2 degrees Celsius, and there would be stray storms that brought snowfall, adding to the risk of avalanches. Visibility was great if it was not snowing, and these would be the times that climbers had to take advantage of. In preparation for her summit bid, Suzanne, like most climbers, would begin with acclimatization trips, which consist of traveling to a higher altitude point, resting, and allowing your body to become used to these conditions before returning back to your starting location. Normally, this is repeated multiple times and is not only useful for climbers, but it is also helpful to provide information to the expedition leaders. On acclimatization trips, Sherpas can see firsthand how clients will respond in different situations, and it is safe to say that there were very concerning signs for Suzanne. Accompanied by a Sherpa in the first week of May, they would take their first acclimatization trip, but would not make it far, as Suzanne struggled to make it past Crompton Point, a location 250 meters above Everest Base Camp. Normally, it would take an experienced mountaineer 20 minutes to reach this location. However, it took Suzanne over 5 hours on her first try. Not wanting to give up, she would attempt the traverse again a few days later, but this time, it would take her 6 hours. It became clear to the Sherpas that Suzanne would not be fit to climb Everest. They were honest with her and heavily warned against continuing, but she would not listen. At the age of 59, Suzanne had a dream of becoming the first Asian woman to summit Everest with a pacemaker, and would state that she had to climb the peak, as the fee for acquiring permission had already been paid in full. There is no record of Suzanne having any climbing experience, other than receiving confirmation that she completed an Everest Base Camp hike the year before in 2022. Working as a teacher in one of the largest government schools in Silvassa, India, it appears as though she led a very normal lifestyle. Suzanne was not overly active, and it is clear she did not have the necessary experience for a mountain like Everest. Despite all this, the 59-year-old teacher would not take no for an answer and would participate in her third acclimation trip during the second week of May. They started in the morning. There were a few clouds, but nothing too worrisome. Hours would tick by as the sun burned over them, moving across the sky. Each step, you could hear the crunch of white snow under boots. By the time they had reached Crompton Point, 12 hours had passed. 6 hours slower than her previous time, and by far the worst time yet. A very concerning sign was that Suzanne was not showing any progress. In fact, quite the opposite. Each attempt, her times have increased, indicating she was not improving, but rather declining. After this trip, Suzanne reported issues with her throat and stated that she found it very challenging to swallow food. On top of that, she had started to develop a cold and was beginning to feel sick. It was clear to her Sherpa a more direct approach was needed, and thus they had a conversation where Suzanne was told word for word that if she continued, she would die. It's hard to understand what was going through her head at this moment. Despite being told such a harrowing thought, and against all advice given to her, she refused to leave base camp, determined to climb Everest at any cost. Unfortunately, at this point, Suzanne was becoming a safety risk to not only herself but to those around her as well. Her condition rapidly deteriorated as the sickness was becoming worse each day. Suzanne would begin her Everest attempt on May 17th, but there is not much to be said about this, as she would only make it 500 meters above base camp before having to stop. The Sherpa with Suzanne had seen enough, and strongly against her wishes called in a helicopter to have her evacuated. Even though she had not made much progress, her condition had gotten so bad she could no longer climb down from their location. When the helicopter arrived, Suzanne refused to go and had to be forcibly removed from the mountain. She was in such a bad state they flew her directly to Lukla, a small town in northeastern Nepal, for medical assistance, where she would receive care all night, but unfortunately at 5 a.m. on May 18th was pronounced dead. Her body would be transported to Kathmandu for an autopsy to further learn more, and from there, family would take over. This story is truly unique because in the past seasons on Everest, there would have never been an inexperienced climber like Suzanne. Being the tallest mountain in the world, many look at it as some sort of challenge, a box on a piece of paper that can be checked off by a pencil. But if you don't take the mountain seriously, it's not a matter of if a similar story like Suzanne's will occur, it's only a matter of when. It was hard for Malaysian climber Ag Askandar bin Ampuan Yaakob to hide his excitement as he arrived at Everest Base Camp in early May. Originally from Kampung Benoni Papar, Sabah, he served as a Malaysian police officer and lived a relatively active lifestyle. The 55-year-old was a family man with a loving wife and 6 children who he thought the world of. After work, most of Yaakob's time was spent actively playing with his kids, and on special occasions he would be seen bringing a child to work with him. Yaakob certainly lived a healthy lifestyle, maybe more so than your average individual, but his major mountaineering experience was very limited. He had attempted to climb Everest before, but was unsuccessful. Yaakob was a known extreme sports enthusiast, but not particularly for climbing, more so scuba diving and parachuting. Whether for the challenge or just the experience, Yaakob traveled to Everest, where he would be joining the Nepali Pioneer Adventures expedition. As soon as they arrived, the team began acclimation climbs, where despite his age, Yaakob was able to do well. He certainly was not the fastest, but could hold his own, and the Sherpas were not too concerned with him attempting for the summit. However, the weather changed rapidly during the first 2 weeks of May, as a big storm would creep onto the mountain. Some days were spent doing the necessary preparations and acclimation trips, while on other days visibility would be so poor that you were lucky to get anything done. Yaakob did his best to become accustomed to the conditions, where he faced on average -2 degrees Celsius or 27 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures. After the initial 2 weeks, the acclimation trips were finished, and the team was finally preparing for the summit push. The weather would clear around May 15th, and many expeditions would take advantage and start their climbs. Each climber had to be considerate of each other, as the space is limited, especially the higher up you climb. The Pioneer Adventures team would begin their climb at this time, as well following the popular South Col route. Over the next few days, they made steady progress up the mountain. The sky stayed clear, except for a stray floating cloud, and the bright sun rays bounced off the snow onto Yaakob's face. His breathing grew heavy as he climbed higher and higher. On May 18th, right before the sun set, they had reached the location of Camp 4, right around 8,000 meters. Heaps of trash and empty oxygen bottles were left scattered on the ground, frustrating all the climbers that saw this, but there was little they could personally do to fix the issue. The buildup of trash being left over from all the different expeditions on Everest is a growing problem that is not being addressed well. The most impacted areas are obviously base camp and surprisingly the higher altitude camps, but there have been recent reports of trash being thrown into crevasses, as it is an easier solution than bringing it down the mountain. Yaakob and the team settled in for the night and got some much needed rest as they had a big day ahead of them. On May 19th, they awoke before the sun had risen in the sky, as the anticipation in the group was steadily building. Today was the day for their summit push. They started their climb, but it was not long before the group noticed something was wrong with Jakob. His progress was slower, and he needed to take more breaks, but this was not much of a worrying sign and actually made sense because they were well into the death zone. This just means that above a certain point in altitude, around 8,000 meters, is where the level of oxygen is insufficient to sustain human life for an extended time span. Despite not feeling as well as he could, Jakob would keep climbing for hours until he eventually reached the south summit, a popular location for climbers to rest. Now, the south summit of Everest is about 130 meters away from the official summit, but in order to reach it, you have to climb down about 11 meters. From there, do the Cornice Traverse, which is a single ledge sitting on a high altitude point between two sides that many climbers have to traverse, followed by passing the famous Hillary Step and on to the official summit. The sun was almost directly above him, but Jakob could not find the strength to move. He was becoming easily confused, and it became clear to those around him that he was developing altitude sickness. The Sherpas and crew members around him recognized that they needed to act fast in order to give Jakob the best chance of survival. Unfortunately, to bring someone down the mountain from the death zone is very tricky, and multiple Sherpas had to be involved, which took some time to organize. But after about an hour, they were ready to go and began descending. The goal was to reach Camp 4 as fast as possible and get Jakob out of the death zone. Each step they moved closer and closer to safety. It was a race against time as the Sherpas continued to carry Jakob down the mountain. They would check on him every so often, but before reaching Camp 4, he would become unresponsive. Unfortunately, he would never make it back and was pronounced dead on Everest. His body would be left somewhere in the South Col region, where it was retrieved the next day. His family would receive the body back in Malaysia, where he now rests in his hometown. Suzanne and Jakob were two completely different individuals, but both with dreams of climbing the tallest mountain in the world, yet they died only a day apart. Their stories truly highlight their growing concerns in the mountaineering community of the amount of permits granted and who they are being granted to. There is no doubt that more regulations are needed, but at the end of the day, money talks the loudest.